Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of, actually, we're not asking that question. So the video which I was going to do is going to come next week, which is going to be on William Jennings Bryan. But in today's video we're going to be looking at Hitler's fallacies, right? So this is top 4 fallacies. Now recently I've finished reading his second book, the Zweig's book. Yes, Hitler actually wrote 2 books. You know, everyone always knows about Mein Kampf, but actually it was a situation where, so he wrote Mein Kampf, published it, but in those early days before he came to power, not many people had actually read it, and so his publisher advised, before you release a second book, let's just hold back on it, right? Because it will affect the sales of Mein Kampf negatively, right? But within the Zweig's book, that basically is a book which focuses on foreign policy. So many years before I'd read Mein Kampf, and so I wasn't going to read the whole thing again because I basically remember most of it. So because I'd finished reading Zweig's book, I decided that what I was going to do is make a video, which is kind of a follow-on from the video we did last week talking about appeasement. So definitely check that video out. But within this, what we're going to basically look at is what ideas came to Hitler, right, which it turned out to just be wrong on all accounts, right? So no one's an island, right? Everyone is affected by the ideas which are floating around them at the time. And so within this story, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Hitler, the person, right? And rather than just looking at just, the evil man that he was, right? Because the thing is, as Jordan Peterson says, right, it's the situation where each of us has the capacity to do great good and great evil, right? And if we don't recognize that, if we can distance ourselves from the great evildoers of history, then it means that we won't really understand the lessons, right? If we don't look at ourselves and see how we could end up basically become like Hitler, then we will never fully understand history and we'll never really understand the human spirit. So within this video, I'm going to give a very, very brief biography of Hitler. Not exactly a very in-depth one, but just touching on some of the things which influenced him in his early days that many people won't know about. Okay, so within this, I want you to picture yourself, right? You are Adolf Hitler and you're 18 years old, right? Now, your father, a few years ago, died, right? And you had a very strained relationship with him. He used to beat you quite a lot, etc. And in particular, after one of your younger brothers died, so when you were like 10 years old or 11, your younger brother died. So before, you used to be like a very outgoing person, very cheerful person, etc. But after your brother died, you end up becoming a very withdrawn person, and also you became very rebellious both towards your father and towards your teachers, right? Now your father, because of the nature of his work, he ended up moving about quite a lot. So it's very difficult for you to kind of settle down and have like a close group of friends and close people that were around you and stuff. So as a result of all this, you kind of felt very detached from people. And on top of that, your father was very strict and said, right, I want you to go to a trade school. I want you to go to the so-called real school, which is like a German word for like a trade school, basically. And I want you to study there. However, in your solitude, you found art to be a good outlet for how you're feeling. And you end up actually being quite good at art as well. But your father is insisting you have to go to this real school. And so as a result of that, out of protest, you've purposely failed, which means that you don't actually end up passing secondary school. Now, this will have later consequences in your life, which at that time you won't necessarily see. So at the age of 18, you leave your little town and you end up going to settle in Vienna, Austria, which is obviously a massive, massive city. And it's there that you try to apply to art school. Now, art school rejects you not once, but twice, right? And says that your artwork, it's good, but what it would be better is that if you went to an architectural school, because your paintings, when it comes to painting people, is not like so great or detailed. But when it comes to painting buildings, it's very, very detailed. So it would probably be your best bet to go to architect school. However, for you to go to architect school, you had to pass secondary school. So you see, as a result of some of the things that really happened to him, he then was not able to then go on to become an architect. And then later that year, your mother dies, right? So your mother is the light of your life. She's really, really kind. She's really and although your father beats you, your mother is very doting and basically makes you think that you're the best thing that ever existed, right? Even when you were playing with your siblings, you always want to be the leader. You always thought yourself to be special and that you were destined for great things. And so with the death of your mother, you end up basically thinking, well, basically, the whole world's finished, but on top of that, you're an orphan in a strange city at 18 and you've been rejected from the career choice of your life. So now fast forward 2 years and you're 20 and you're basically unemployed, you're basically homeless in a strange city, yeah, you're an orphan, everything in your life has just been ruined, and this is you. This is you now, thinking about you back when you were 18 or 20, put yourself in all this situation, and then you'll understand a little bit of where Hitler was at this point in his life. Now, like many Germans living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time, they had really seen the rise of the German Reich, the second German Reich, the German Empire under the Kaisers. And so for them, they basically was like, okay, we have the choice between, the German Reich, which is a unified German state, or we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is basically just a mismatch of all different ethnicities and nationalities, and it's just a complete mess, right? How can we, as patriots, feel any pride in what is basically the hangover of this kind of medieval kind of thing, this Austrian Empire under the Habsburg? So this is the conundrum which many of them felt, and so as a result of this, many of them felt very detached from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As a matter of fact, when the Austro-Hungarian national anthem would play, they instead would sing the German national anthem, because they felt much more attachment and pride with that. So now that Hitler's out in Vienna, right, and he's down in the dumps, he's homeless, everything's all just really, really terrible at this time, and in Vienna, obviously, it's a very cosmopolitan city, like kind of, it has many different ethnicities from all around the empire. And on top of that, around this time, you end up having pogroms taking place in the Tsarist Empire within Russia. So many Jews fleeing from Poland and from Ukraine and many other places are coming to settle as refugees in Vienna. And the people there are very, very hostile to this, right? And in particular, they end up being whipped up by a very, very influential person that almost no one has heard of. And even before doing this, even I hadn't heard of him, right? And this person is George Ritter von Schonen. As with always, I've probably butchered his pronunciation because I'm terrible with foreign names. But von Schonen, he was a populist politician living in Vienna at the time. And he was very, very influential within Austrian politics. And so this is the man who, more than anyone else, influenced the young Adolf, right, in terms of how he'd be in terms of like for as a future leader. So what exactly was von Schonen's belief? Well, first of all, he was a pan-German, so like very similar to Hitler. He believed that the German-speaking people within Austria and within the Austrian Empire, they should join with the rest of the German Reich. And on top of that, he was very anti-clerical, so he was like very anti kind of the power of the Catholic Church, which had a very dominant position within the Austrian Empire. On top of that, with regard to his supporters, he encouraged them to refer to him as the Führer, and whenever they would greet with each other, it would be with the Heil, right? So Hitler adopted many of these things, and of course one of the main things which he adopted was von Schonen's anti-Semitism. So although von Schonen was a very wealthy man, and his father had worked for the House of Rothschild, and like he become very wealthy and like was involved in like the railway industry, etc., etc. Although he came from a great lot of wealth, how he appealed to the masses was by targeting these Jewish refugees and other Jews who live within Austria, and basically saying they are the reason for all of your problems. Like these people are the enemy. As a matter of fact, he even said the famous line of, either we expel the Jews or the Jews will expel the Germans, right? So this gives you an idea of just how vicious this man was in terms of his anti-Semitism. And actually, he ended up being kicked out of the Austrian parliament as a result of, being arrested, And the reason he was arrested is because he made an attack on a Jewish newspaper because they dared to preemptively print the death of the German Kaiser. So the German Kaiser, Wilhelm I, he died in 1888, I believe. And so just because they printed his death a little bit before he ended up actually dying, this man went to this place and attacked many of the people there. And so although he was arrested, what ended up happening is that there was a great deal of support for him. So he had actually a surge in support for his party. So while he wasn't allowed to return to parliament, he ended up having a lot of political gains as a result of that. He still remained a very influential person within Austrian politics. So Hitler's seen all these things and going, this is something which I can kind of get behind. This is something which I will bear in mind in future, and which will basically shape me for the rest of my life. And on top of that, of course, by the time Hitler's 25, the Great War starts. Yeah, by this time he'd moved to Munich, and throughout the next 4 years, he ends up being a war hero, and basically, he ends up getting a medal and stuff. So he fights very, very bravely. But by the end of the war, he comes to see it as not only just a waste of German life and just a waste of like resources, etc., but also that there's a stab in the back, that there's a betrayal, right? So you've been fighting on the front lines for 4 years. You come back as a 29-year-old and you see a ruined Germany. The Germany which you fought for is no longer there. All of your fellow soldiers were fighting on foreign territory, and no allies actually invaded Germany itself, and yet you guys were defeated because of these politicians who were in the rear guard, right? So all of this led to his belief that basically the Jews were behind this, and that they were the source of Germany's downfall, and that they were the reason for why Germany was suffering under the Versailles Treaty, and that it was his job, it was his mission to basically undo all of this and restore German pride and German nationalism. So now that we've covered all of the things which basically went into Hitler, right? What we have to look at is the top 4 fallacies which basically completely threw Hitler off course, just led him down a very, very dark path, right? And that's what we're going to get into now. So the first one, of course, is the obvious one, racism. Now, for people at the time, racism was just the norm, right? And it wasn't just something which was believed by like uneducated people, by the lower class, etc., etc. This was believed by the greatest minds of the time, right? All the best scientists, all the greatest philosophers, like all the best composers, everyone, right? And so German culture and basically European culture at the time viewed the world through this lens of racism, and actually of scientific racism, which gave it extra kind of a degree of credibility. And you can understand people at the time thinking this, because at that time, Europe and its offshoots were far ahead of like the rest of the world, of like the so-called like darker races as such. And so, they colonized Africa, they'd wiped out the Native Americans, they'd conquered India, they'd humiliated China. So by looking through that lens, you can kind of see how white people at that time believed that they were just inherently better, which it's a very selective way of looking at world history, and also ignores everything which we now know with regard to why different races developed at different times, etc., etc. And most of it is actually to do more with geography, because on a scientific level, there's no difference between like kind of people of different races, right? Like DNA wasn't even fully discovered until 1954, and so the field of genetics up until that point was very much like is very, very primitive. And so since cracking the human genome and like finding out all these other things, we now know that actually there's very little genetic difference between human beings of different races. So on a biological level, race doesn't actually exist. It's just different pigments and different amounts of melanin depending on where people are and stuff. So that's all it is. So having such a high place on it doesn't really make any scientific sense. On top of all that, Hitler had the belief, which was very widely held at that time, which is that only Aryan people, aka like Nordic people, people from like Northern Europe, basically, blonde hair, blue eye, kind of white people, right? These were the only people who were capable of creating culture. Now, this completely ignores everything from China, everything from India, everything from the Middle East, everything from all around the world, where completely independent of European influence. Never mind, in Africa and like the Americas, etc., etc. Very complex societies and very complex civilizations existing completely independent of any kind of like so-called Aryan influence, right? So this was already a complete nonsense. And on top of that as well, he believed that racially diverse societies and empires and nations in general couldn't survive and couldn't thrive. But we know this to be completely false. I mean, if we look at the Roman Empire, if we look at the Ottoman Empire, if we look at the Persian Empire, even within his lifetime stuff, the British and the French Empire were huge multi-ethnic, multiracial societies, right? And yet still, they were able to be incredibly powerful. So this whole thing of like, nations have to be racially pure in order to have any value is just completely not borne out by any history. And even at the time he was alive, it should have been evidently clear that that's just a nonsense, right? So basically his view on race completely clouded his judgment throughout the rest of his life. And we'll get onto some of this more in terms of like, a little bit later. So for instance, the reason why he said that France was basically becoming less valuable and stuff and was becoming less powerful of a country was because it was allowing black people and other people from like the rest of the French Empire to settle in France. Now at the time, 7% of the French population was immigrant born, and obviously, many of these people would have come from other places in Europe, but many of these people also would have come from North Africa, like from Indochina, such as like Vietnam, etc., etc. So he viewed that as basically degrading France in terms of its racial value, which then meant that it was no longer going to be a great power. So if that's the case, how comes the French end up being very pivotal in the destruction of Germany in the war in which you just fought in? It doesn't really make any sense, does it? Yeah, it's complete just nonsense. And the main thing which he said in terms of race, yeah, well, actually, there's other things as well. We'll get onto those a bit later. But the main thing, which is just provably just is so. Well, first of all, the United States and the Soviet Union, after World War II, they're multiracial societies, and yet they end up becoming global superpowers. So it doesn't make any sense, does it? It's just meh. And the main thing that he believed in, which is just patently just not true, is that Jews are incapable of nation building, right? That they're incapable of having their own country, they're incapable of being farmers, they're incapable of doing all these kind of things, they're incapable of even being warriors, right? The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 completely disproved all of that. And everything that's come since with regard to the State of Israel has completely disproved that. Because, Israel is a very rich, like kind of like agricultural country. It's very innovative. It has a very strong military. Like at least 4 times it's fought for its very survival against like kind of like all competing people, like kind of all surround them, trying to destroy them. So they're great warriors. They're great at building nations, right? They're great at doing all these things. So the existence of the State of Israel today completely disproves his entire theory about the Jews are incapable of building a nation. Never mind the fact that Jews, from the time of like, King David, had the kingdom of Israel, then later you had like the kingdom of Judah and etc., etc. So Jews had, it just is just completely silly. It's completely just nonsense, to say that like Jews are incapable of building any kind of country. And just because at the time, the Jews had been scattered to the 4 corners of the earth, right? Just because they didn't have a nation state at the moment in which he was writing, he completely dismissed it and was like, oh, well, there's no way that they can have their own country. It's just nonsense, So yet again, because of these kind of basic fallacies with regard to his racism, etc., this basically completely it just clouded his judgment. Now we're going to get on to one of the main things, which was basically why he had this kind of view, and that's to do with economics, right? It's to do with the fact that he didn't understand economics. So for Hitler, the main belief that he had was one of autarky and one of shrinking markets. So the idea of shrinking markets is basically saying that, as the poorer countries of the world get richer, that the richer nations, such as Germany, are going to have less places to sell to. And so as a result, we're going to end up competing against places like China and India, etc., etc. And eventually we're going to end up having no customers to sell to, and then it's going to cause the collapse of the West. Now, this is obviously just completely economically illiterate, because obviously people still buy German goods, people still buy British goods, American goods, etc., etc. Like what ends up being produced in countries, it ends up just changing. And also as well, this is another reason as well, like he viewed the Jews in terms of, okay, some Jews are very, very wealthy, and he couldn't understand the fact of many of them were like wealthy because of finance. And so for many people, if they can't see something being physically built, they're like, oh, you're just moving money around. They don't understand like how money is created and what money represents, and etc., etc. So this kind of fundamental misunderstanding of economics, right, is basically what led him to being a socialist. Now, I know many people will say, oh no, Hitler wasn't a socialist. I mean, it's in the title, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? But if that's not enough proof for you, is the fact of, just listen to what Hitler said throughout his life, and also look at what Hitler did when he was in office. So within Mein Kampf and within Zweig's book, what he critiques, for instance, the Soviet Union with, is not that it's socialist, right? He complains about it because he says it's not anti-capitalist enough. He believes basically that the Soviet Union is just Jewish international capitalism. So, try and work that out, He believes that communism is basically capitalism, right? But in terms of like his views, right? If you look at his 25 points, which is basically the manifesto of the Nazi Party, a lot of it is to do with, you know, nationalize this, nationalize that, etc., etc. And I can't remember whether it was Hitler himself or whether it was Joseph Goebbels said this, but they said the thing of, what is the point in nationalizing industries when we can nationalize human beings? So, in other words, if you control the people, why do you need to control businesses? Through the control of the people, you already indirectly control those businesses. So what's the point in the state actually taking us over when, in actual fact, the state is everything? The state encompasses everyone. And much like Karl Marx, you know, like Karl Marx, he was ethnically a Jew, but if you look at what Karl Marx said about Jews, he basically said that, you know, Jews are money grabbers and like they're behind capitalism, etc., etc. So if you look at all these kind of things, yeah, like that, the reasons why Hitler is opposed to capitalism is very much the same reason that Marx was opposed to capitalism, because of the link with Jews, right? So capitalism is run by Jews, communism is run by the Jews. So as a result of that, yeah, Hitler is opposed to both of those kind of things, right? And on top of that, with regard to Hitler's worldview in terms of economics, right, he was very much a protectionist. He was in favour of autarky. So autarky is everything has to be produced in the country. So, for instance, I believe it was Hitler who said this, the famous thing of the only thing that the Third Reich should import is coffee and cigarettes, right? So that kind of gives you an idea. Everything which can be made in Germany ought to be. And this leads to why he believed in the kind of Drang nach Osten. In other words, his drive to the east. He was looking for Lebensraum, which is living space. So his idea was, right, Germany, the only way for it to be self-sufficient is by expanding and taking over the land from the Slavs, kicking those people off, you know, or like exterminating them, and then settling those lands with Germans. So for him, he couldn't understand about international trade and benefits of that. So he basically viewed the world in a zero-sum game, yeah, right? Which is what we've kind of discussed in other videos as well. This idea that, you know, there's a fixed pie, and if one person becomes rich, then it means that someone else has to become poor. And so if one country becomes powerful, it means that another country has to be weak. You know, so we couldn't understand the fact of like Germany could, you know, expand economically without militarily taking places over, which just is not borne out by any economic theory at all, right? It's very much just kind of mercantilism, and you already had Adam Smith over a century before who disproved all of this and showed the benefits of free trade. So again, you know, Hitler was economically illiterate, and he was obviously clouded by his racism, which basically ended up shaping his foreign policy, which is what we're going to get onto now. Now, before getting into Hitler's foreign policy, don't forget sub if you haven't already. We're trying to hit 2,000 subscribers by Christmas, so help us out with that. We're on 1,500 already. We've already passed 1,500. Yeah, I know it's a bit ambitious to what you expect 500 subs in the space of a month. However, if we look at the statistics here, most of you who are watching are not subbed. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know why you're doing that. Or how can you watch this and not sub? Like, does that even make sense? Like, come on now. And also don't forget to hit the like button as well. And now, with all that being said, now we can get back onto Hitler's foreign policy. So the first thing we want to talk about with regard to Hitler's foreign policy fallacies is this. His view on Russia was completely tied in with this whole racial view, right? So Hitler believed that Russia, you know, at the time when the Tsars ran it, he believed that, you know, because the aristocracy there was largely of Germanic origin, etc. So he believed that, you know, under the Tsars, you know, Russia was, well, a nation of basically inferior Slavs, but at least they were governed by superior Germans. However, with the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, he believed that the Jews had used the Slavs to overthrow their German masters, and therefore the Soviet Union was now just a kind of just racially worthless. So that's what Hitler believed, right? But as a result of this, it meant that his view of the Soviet Union was completely out of whack with what it was in reality, right? Because he always underestimated the Soviet Union and the potential of the Soviet people. You can see this most clearly in his thing, you know, just before Barbarossa, yeah, where he says, we have only to kick in the door and the entire rotten structure will come collapsing in. Now, any look at the Soviet Union, yeah, and any look at Russia and Russia's history, in particular with regard to Napoleon, would have shown that that was completely wrong. And that one should never like underestimate Russia. Russia has always, you know, done like great things and stuff, and has always been able to like expel invaders and stuff, right? So this idea that, oh, because they're racially impure, that you're going to just be able to just walk in there, yeah, that, yeah, they're just going to run and collapse, and like, this is complete nonsense. And as a result of that, that's basically how his whole view on Russia was kind of completely skewed. And so with the Battle of Stalingrad and all the rest of it that came, it was a massive shock to him. He was like, how are these people being able to beat us? And this is where the kind of myth of like, oh, the German generals didn't lose the war because of because of their own incompetencies and stuff, and Hitler didn't lose because of his own incompetencies. It was just hordes and hordes of these kind of Asiatic masses, like these Asiatic hordes who basically just overwhelmed the Germans by superior numbers. And this is not shown in the field at all. Like, and time again, the Russians beat the Germans both tactically and even without like numerical superiority, they still would have beaten them. We can also see the same prejudices when it comes to the United States. So in Mein Kampf, he said that, America is racially valueless, it's just a nation of mongrels, and therefore like there's nothing to worry about. And then in the Zweig's book, he then says that actually, the Americans are the #1 enemy, and that they're the main people that Europe needs to unite against in order to kind of like, preserve their own independence. Now, which is it? Like, kind of, are they a nation of mongrels? Or are they a nation that ought to be feared? Or can a nation of mongrels still be racially feared, or whatever? It just there's no consistency in what Hitler's arguing, and because when you start picking something like race, which has no scientific basis in it, it just completely skews your entire worldview. For instance, obviously, if you look at like race with regard to IQ, right, as we covered in our previous video before, right, if you look at African Americans in the North, they had a higher IQ than the average Southern white had, right? So that's only a tiny geographic difference, and yet you can really see huge differences in terms of IQ based on culture, on value, on education, all these kind of things. So it's just complete nonsense here. To write off America because it's made up of all different races just means that you just have no real clue on geopolitics at all. Although one thing that Hitler did get right was that the EU wouldn't work long term, right? Now, what I mean by this is, if you read Zweig's book, at the time, people were already talking about the idea of having a federal Europe, of having a united Europe. And within the Zweig's book, Hitler talks about this, and he explains why it's not going to work. Now, he thought it wasn't going to work for racial reasons, but it's not going to work because of different cultural reasons, So that's the tiny part where he is like correct, right? Don't want to say that too many times, but if you think about it, the EU is made up of all different cultures, right? And all different people with all different competing histories and all competing interests. So the idea that the European Union is going to be able to come together to stand up against America, stand up against Russia, stand up against China, we can already see within our own time that each of the nations within the EU has their own view on how they view America, how they view Russia, and how they view China. And even with regard to Brexit, you can really see the difference. There are some countries, like France, which are very, very hostile to Brexit, and other countries which are semi-supportive of it, and other countries which are just completely indifferent to it, right? The reason why many German intellectuals believed this at the time was they're like, right, we've been beaten in World War One, so the way we can still exert dominance over Europe is through greater integration, through like kind of peaceful means and through economic trade, which is largely what the Germans have done in the modern age. However, Hitler was right in basically saying that this would never really work out, and that actually, in order to have like great power, in order to have like great economic power, you also need to have great military power, because no one outside of like Germany is worried about Germany. Because Germany has become pacifist after World War II, it means that yes, Germany's got a huge military, but if you look at how Russia deals with Germany, if you look at how China deals with Germany, if you look at how America deals with Germany, no one's scared of Germany, right? And this is something which Hitler did get right. So, let's tick one tiny part of his fallacies off. Although, still in broad terms, his foreign policy was incorrect. And we'll get on to the rest of that now. So the two countries which Hitler in the Zweig's book talks about, and talks about how like Germany ought to be allies with them, are England and Italy. So first of all, we'll talk about with Italy, right? So Italy, obviously, at that time, you had Benito Mussolini who had taken over, so fascism had taken over in Italy. And what Hitler was saying in the Zweig's book is that Italy's interests are within the Mediterranean and Germany's interests are within Eastern Europe. And therefore, in terms of like the different powers within Europe, like Italy's interests and Germany's interests will never collide. So they make a natural ally. Now, the fact that Italy had turned on the Central Powers in World War One, and the fact that for our own timeline we know like, Italy switched side in World War Two, maybe the Italians are not the best people to ally yourselves with. Yeah, just saying, like, kind of, if they do it in one world war, they're likely to do it in another one. So he was really wrong in that regard. Yes, obviously Hitler ended up having an alliance with Mussolini's Italy, but the usefulness of that alliance, he very much like kind of overplayed, and World War II basically showed that this was a very foolish endeavor. The second thing is with regard to like his wanting an alliance with England. Now, within this, he completely didn't understand England at all, and unfortunately many Germans still don't understand England today, right? Many Germans kind of see England as being like a fellow like Germanic people and stuff, and that basically, they think the same way as us, they think in a kind of continental way, etc., etc. And so for Hitler, he basically believed that like England had no problem with Germany, and that the only reason why they had a problem with them was because the Kaiser was building up a huge navy, and this threatened the empire, right? Now, that's partly true. However, it ignores the fact of Britain's only concern is not just with the empire, but it's also with the continent, right? And, because the empire is over there, but what happens on the continent is very important, because if England's going to be invaded, it's through the continent. And so although he was well aware of the balance of power theory, which I've outlined in previous videos, right, he completely dismisses that in his Zweig's book and goes, no, don't worry about it. The reason why England actually went to war with us in 1914 was because of the threat to the empire, not realizing that, as would happen in 1939 when Germany tried to become a hegemon in Europe, Britain went to war with them, because England can never accept any hegemonic power on the continent, because that poses an existential threat to England herself, and so that's why it can never be allowed. So Hitler completely ignored all that, and because of his racial bias, he saw the English as being a fellow Nordic, Aryan people, and so as a result, he kind of was like, okay, cool, what they're doing is basically a good thing for the world, and we just want to emulate the British, so like the British have India, we want to basically do an India in in Eastern Europe. So that was a complete misunderstanding of what the English were trying to do and how the English viewed the rest of Europe. So that's a massive reason why he, even in World War II, all the way up to like Dunkirk, etc., the Blitz, everything, he was like, I can't understand why these people are angry at me. Why are these people at war with me? They should be on my side. So this is a major fallacy that Hitler had, and again, it's based on racism. It's based on a lack of understanding of geopolitics. So now we're going to talk about the final major fallacy that Hitler had, and that's to do with how he viewed his own people, right? This is to do with Hitler's elitism. If one is to read Mein Kampf and Zweig's book, and I highly recommend for all historians to read both of them, what one will find throughout it is an ongoing thing where it's talking about basically a disdain for the masses. Talking about the people as if they're stupid and that they need an intelligent, strong leader to basically lead them, right? And all tyrants, all authoritarians have always believed this, because they believe themselves to be better than the people, and that they believe naturally someone like them, of course, ought to be the ones who are running society. So Hitler, as we've said before, from a very young age has a very high opinion of himself, and so as a result of that, he always viewed other people as being inferior, and he always saw himself as being a natural leader, and therefore it's his job to lead the nation to greatness. So the thing is, many people have said that Hitler is very much a populist. However, populists have a genuine love of the people and believe that the people are like the source of all wisdom and etc., etc. But Hitler had very much the opposite view, which is why he was most opposed to a liberal democracy, right? So many people think that Hitler's biggest enemy ideologically was communism. Actually, what he railed against was liberal democracy. In fact, in Mein Kampf, he devotes an entire chapter to basically derailing a liberal democracy, right, and parliamentary democracy. So for him, the big threat was democracy, because he said that what it ends up doing is there's no clear leadership, there's no accountability, and as a result, the people are stupid, the people need to be led, and so if you allow the people to have power, they're just going to go all over the place, and you're going to end up just having bad policies. So you see this even nowadays with many kind of like elitists, these kind of anti-populists, who basically think, oh, the people are stupid, they don't know what they're voting for, they need to basically be led by very clever people like ourselves, and that's how society ought to be run. It basically ought to be run by technocrats, and it ought to be basically run by, well, us. So that's kind of a very arrogant view, a very elitist view, and this is one of the main things that Hitler believed in, which was a major fallacy of his, because of course, no one is a complete genius, no one has all information, right? And when that much power is put in the hands of anyone, people are bound to make mistakes. And actually, within all of this, this is what I want to basically talk about, so this is kind of the conclusion of the video. A few years ago, one of my work colleagues, made a good point to me, because I'm obviously very interested in politics, and I asked her about, like, what's your views on politics? And she said to me something which was very, very profound, which is that with politics, no matter what policy you end up implementing, someone somewhere is going to be negatively affected by it, right? So, if you raise taxes, someone's going to be negatively affected. If you lower taxes, people are going to be negatively affected. If you nationalize things, then people are going to be negatively affected. And if you privatize things, people are going to be, et cetera, et cetera. And in infinitum, right? Or in infinitum, whatever the Latin phrase is. But the point is that no matter what policies you want to do, someone somewhere is going to be negatively affected by it. And therefore, all of us have to look in on ourselves and think, right, the things that we want, the policies that we want, how will they negatively affect someone, right? Because you're not going to be able to please all the people. Someone's going to be hurt by the policies that you want. And actually, the less that you understand about human nature, the less that you understand about economics, the less you understand about history and philosophy and all the rest of it, right? The less you understand about all these things, the more likely it is that you're going to make mistakes which are going to hurt people. So all of these things which were laid out here, right, even if you don't have a single one of these fallacies which Hitler believed in, right, you invariably have some fallacies, right? You invariably have some mistakes. You invariably have things which, if they were implemented, would hurt someone. So for instance, for me, I'm an English nationalist, I believe that England ought to be separate from the United Kingdom. But then with that policy there, I'm fully in recognition that negatively affects British Unionists who live in Scotland, who live in Wales and live in Northern Ireland. Similarly as well, those people in favour of United Ireland, people who are Ulster Unionists, they're going to be negatively affected. And then similarly, if there's no United Ireland, then the Irish nationalists are going to be negatively affected by this, right? So no matter what policy you want, it's going to affect someone. And so what one has to do as much as possible is base one's politics on coherent and firm principles, right, which you don't just change, etc., but which also you allow a level of flexibility where you go, actually, not everyone has the view that I have, right? That's a big part of living in a pluralistic liberal democracy. It's understanding that, I might think, oh, I hate the rich, but then what if my mate wants to set up a company, right, and ends up becoming wealthy? How's that going to negatively affect him? And, oh, I want this and want that. Whatever it is, we have to understand that we're all human, and that in a democracy, we all have different views, right? And that no one is more valuable than any other person. And when we understand that, we're much less likely to think that we have all the answers, and we actually humble ourselves and we listen more rather than just talk, which is essentially what all big-headed people like myself often end up doing. So in conclusion to that, we're going to basically end this video and basically say that, I hope that you like it, and also don't forget to share this with people as well. Hit the like button, and obviously subscribe as well. We're trying to obviously reach 2,000 subs like we said. I think it can be done by Christmas. I'm very optimistic about that, but invariably someone is going to be hurt somewhere. Although then again, YouTube's not a zero-sum game. If you want to sub to me, then you can sub to other channels as well. It's not going to hurt anyone. It helped me out quite a lot. So the next video is going to be on William, Jen and Brian. I absolutely promise it is going to be, unless I think of something else. But yeah, in the meantime, have a great day and bye.